The world's most luxurious prison meals. Halden Prison, Norway. The budget figures had been approved 3 times. Nobody had questioned them. Nobody had flagged them. Nobody had placed them alongside the outcome data that would have made their approval impossible to defend. Stay with this story, because what the Norwegian Correctional Service found when it finally read both sets of numbers in the same room had been hiding inside a celebrated success story for years. Halden Fengsel sits in the municipality of Halden in southeastern Norway, approximately 100 kilometers south of Oslo. It opened in 2010 and immediately attracted international attention. Journalists, criminologists, prison reform advocates, and government delegations from more than 40 countries visited in its first decade. It was described in publications across Europe, North America, and Australia as proof that a radically different model of incarceration was not only philosophically possible but operationally viable. The food program was central to that reputation. Halden's kitchen operated on a philosophy that was explicitly documented in the facility's founding design principles. Food was not a reward or a privilege. It was a component of rehabilitation. Inmates cooked alongside trained culinary staff. Meals were prepared from fresh ingredients. Dietary preferences were accommodated. The kitchen was designed to look and function like a professional culinary environment, not an institutional one. By every published metric, it worked. Recidivism rates at Halden were among the lowest ever recorded for a maximum security facility in the Norwegian system. International observers consistently cited the food and cooking program as one of the factors contributing to the facility's outcomes. What nobody had measured was what happened when the program's most celebrated elements were replicated elsewhere. The person who first identified the gap was not a critic of the Halden model. He was one of its strongest institutional advocates. His name was Erik Solberg, a senior policy analyst at the Norwegian Correctional Service who had spent 7 years studying rehabilitation program outcomes across the Norwegian prison system. He had published 2 papers on the relationship between food autonomy and reintegration outcomes. He had cited Halden's kitchen program in both. He had recommended its expansion in a 2018 internal policy review that had been accepted and implemented across 4 additional facilities. In the spring of 2022, Solberg was conducting a routine 5-year outcome review of the expansion program. What he found in the comparative data stopped him before he reached the end of the first table. The 4 facilities that had implemented versions of Halden's kitchen model between 2018 and 2020 showed measurably improved inmate engagement metrics across most documented categories. The program had been implemented. It had been running. By every process measure, it was functioning as designed. But the recidivism outcomes, the metric that had made Halden's approach internationally famous, were not replicating. Not marginally. Not within acceptable statistical variance. The gap between Halden's documented recidivism outcomes and the outcomes at the 4 expansion facilities was significant enough that it could not be attributed to population differences, sentence length variation, or any of the standard demographic variables Solberg had controlled for in his methodology. Something about the replication was producing different results than the original. He spent 2 weeks eliminating variables before he focused on the one that remained. The food programs at the 4 expansion facilities had been implemented using Halden's documented specifications. Ingredient quality standards. Preparation methodology. Inmate participation structures. Kitchen design principles. Everything that had been written down about what Halden did had been transferred to the expansion sites. What had not been written down, because it had never been formally identified as a variable, was the specific character of the staff relationships inside Halden's kitchen. The culinary staff at Halden had not been recruited from institutional food service backgrounds. They had been recruited from professional restaurant and hospitality environments. Their relationship with the inmates they worked alongside was not supervisory in the conventional correctional sense. It was collaborative in a way that had developed organically over years and had never been codified in any policy document. The expansion sites had hired institutional food service staff and asked them to implement a professional culinary model. The ingredient lists were the same. The equipment was comparable. The documented procedures were followed. But the thing that the international observers had consistently described as the program's most distinctive quality, the atmosphere in the kitchen, the specific dynamic between staff and inmates, had not transferred. Because it had never been documented. Because no one had identified it as the variable that mattered most. Solberg wrote that observation in his review notes on a Tuesday evening. He sat with it for a long time. Then he pulled the budget approval documents for the expansion program and read them alongside his outcome data for the first time. But when he checked the original Halden program evaluation reports that had informed the expansion decision, everything changed. The original Halden program evaluation reports had been produced by 3 separate research teams between 2012 and 2017. All 3 were rigorous. All 3 were peer-reviewed. All 3 had been cited in the policy review that authorized the expansion. Solberg had cited them himself. He had read them before. He was reading them differently now. The first report, produced in 2012 by a team from the University of Oslo, had focused on inmate well-being metrics, self-reported satisfaction, psychological assessment scores, engagement participation rates. It had documented Halden's food program extensively. It had noted the professional kitchen environment, the fresh ingredient quality, the collaborative preparation model. It had not measured staff background or staff-inmate relationship quality as independent variables. The research team had not considered them variables at all. They had been treated as contextual details, descriptive elements of the program's environment rather than causal components of its outcomes. The second report, from 2015, had focused on reintegration outcomes. It had documented recidivism rates at 24-month post-release intervals. It had identified the food and autonomy program as a contributing factor in positive outcomes. It had cited inmate interviews describing the kitchen experience as formative. It had not analyzed what specifically about the kitchen experience was producing the cited effect. The third report, from 2017, had been the most comprehensive. It had synthesized findings from the previous 2 and made specific program expansion recommendations. It had been the primary evidence base for the 2018 policy review that Solberg had contributed to and that had authorized the expansion. That report had noted, in a single paragraph on page 31, that the staff-inmate dynamic in Halden's kitchen was characterized by an unusually collaborative professional culture that may be difficult to replicate in institutional environments without equivalent staff recruitment and orientation practices. One paragraph. Page 31. Described as, may be difficult. Not flagged as a prerequisite. Not identified as a replication risk. Not translated into a staffing specification for the expansion program. Solberg found the paragraph at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. He read it 4 times. The information had been present in the evidence base. It had been documented by the research team that produced the report. It had been available to everyone who had read the report before authorizing the expansion, including Solberg himself. He had read that report. He had cited that report. He had recommended the expansion based in part on that report. He had not registered that paragraph as significant. Neither had anyone else on the policy review committee. The expansion program had been designed, approved, and implemented by people who had read the evidence carefully and missed the most operationally significant finding in it. Not because they were careless. Not because the evidence was buried or obscured. Because the finding had been framed as an observation rather than a warning. As a contextual note rather than a causal variable. As something that may be difficult rather than something that will fail if not addressed. The language of academic caution had made a critical finding invisible to the practitioners who most needed to act on it. Solberg requested the staffing records for all 4 expansion facilities. What he found confirmed what he had already concluded but added a dimension he had not anticipated. 2 of the 4 facilities had made genuine attempts to recruit staff with professional culinary backgrounds. The attempts had been unsuccessful, not because of institutional indifference but because the compensation structure for correctional facility kitchen positions was significantly below the market rate for professional culinary staff in the Norwegian labor market. The budget approval documents for the expansion program had allocated funding for ingredient quality and kitchen equipment at Halden's specification level. They had not allocated additional funding for competitive culinary staff compensation. The expansion had been funded to replicate everything about Halden's kitchen that could be purchased. It had not been funded to replicate the one element that couldn't, the professional staff culture that had developed over years in an environment that paid and treated its kitchen staff differently from the institutional norm. The budget gap between what the expansion had been given and what competitive culinary compensation would have required was not large in the context of the program's total cost. Solberg calculated it on the back of a notepad. Per facility, per year, the difference between institutional food service compensation rates and professional culinary market rates for the number of kitchen staff positions involved was approximately 340,000 Norwegian kroner. Across 4 facilities over 4 years of operation, the total underfunding of the staff compensation component, the component that the 2017 report had identified as potentially critical to replication, was approximately 5.4 million kroner. The 4-facility expansion program had cost 180 million kroner to design, build, and implement. The element most likely to determine whether it worked had been underfunded by 5.4 million kroner out of a 180 million kroner program. 3%. Solberg prepared a formal internal review memo. It was 14 pages. It documented the outcome gap, the 2017 report paragraph, the staffing records, the compensation analysis, and the budget calculation. He submitted it to the Norwegian Correctional Service's Program Evaluation Director on a Friday morning. The response arrived the following Thursday. It was not what he had expected. The Evaluation Director's response acknowledged the outcome gap. It acknowledged the staffing compensation finding. It noted that the 2017 report had been reviewed by the committee and that its findings had been considered in the expansion design process. Then it said something that stopped Solberg mid-page. It noted that the staffing compensation gap had been identified during the budget approval process. It had been raised by a member of the facilities planning team. It had been reviewed. And it had been deliberately set aside. Not because the finding was disputed. Not because the compensation gap was considered insignificant. Because the Budget Approval Committee had concluded that the expansion program needed to demonstrate viability at existing compensation structures before additional funding for premium staff recruitment could be politically justified. The plan had been to prove the program worked first, then request the additional funding. The outcome data Solberg was now holding showed what had happened instead. The program had been implemented at reduced specification. It had produced reduced outcomes. And those reduced outcomes were now the evidence base against which any future funding request for the compensation gap would be evaluated. The decision to underfund the critical variable had produced the outcome data that made correcting the underfunding harder to justify. The committee had created the problem it had deferred solving. Solberg read the evaluation director's response 3 times. Then he made a request that the response had not anticipated. He asked for the minutes of the budget approval meeting at which the staffing compensation gap had been identified, raised, and set aside. The minutes arrived 2 days later. What they contained was not a record of negligence or indifference. It was something more difficult to address than either. The budget meeting minutes were dated March 14, 2018. 12 people had been present. The meeting had run for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The minutes were detailed. Not a summary but a near-verbatim record of the discussion, produced by a professional minute-taker and approved by all attendees within 2 weeks of the session. Solberg read them in a single sitting. The staffing compensation issue had been raised 40 minutes into the meeting by a facilities planning officer named Astrid Mohn. Her contribution was recorded in full. She had noted that Halden's kitchen outcomes were inseparable from its staff culture. She had cited the 2017 report paragraph directly, reading it aloud into the meeting record. She had presented a compensation analysis showing the gap between institutional food service rates and professional culinary market rates. She had recommended that the expansion budget include a supplementary staffing allocation to enable competitive recruitment. Her recommendation had been discussed for 31 minutes. It had been set aside by a vote of 7-5. The reasoning recorded in the minutes was not dismissive of Mohn's analysis. The majority position acknowledged the compensation gap as a legitimate concern. It acknowledged the 2017 report's observation as potentially significant. The decision to proceed without the supplementary allocation rested on two recorded arguments. The first was political. The expansion program was being presented to the Norwegian Parliament as a cost-effective model, evidence that Halden's outcomes could be achieved at scale without Halden's premium operational costs. Introducing a supplementary staffing allocation before the program had demonstrated results would undermine the political case for the expansion by suggesting that Halden's model was only replicable at Halden's cost level. The second was sequential. The committee's recorded position was that the program should be implemented at existing compensation structures, outcomes should be monitored over a 3-year period, and if the outcomes demonstrated the staffing gap's significance, a supplementary funding request would be made with outcome evidence as its justification. The logic was internally coherent. Implement, measure, then correct if necessary. What it required was that the correction be made. Solberg turned to the follow-up documentation. The 3-year monitoring period the committee had specified had elapsed in 2021. The outcome data that should have triggered the supplementary funding review had been available since early 2022, the same data Solberg had been reviewing when he found the outcome gap. He searched the Norwegian Correctional Service's internal policy record for the supplementary funding review the committee had committed to initiating. There was no record of it. The 3-year monitoring period had passed. The outcome data had been produced. The trigger condition the committee had specified had been met. Nobody had pulled the trigger. The reason was not concealment. It was not deliberate inaction. What Solberg found when he traced the follow-up responsibility through the organizational record was something more institutionally mundane and more difficult to remedy. Astrid Mohn, the facilities planning officer who had raised the compensation concern, who had been the minority voice in the 7-5 vote, and who had been the person most likely to initiate the follow-up review, had left the Norwegian Correctional Service in late 2020. The institutional memory of the committee's conditional commitment had left with her. The majority who had voted to defer the supplementary allocation had done so with the understanding that the follow-up review was Mohn's professional domain. When she departed, no one had been assigned her role's institutional memory. The commitment had not been formally documented as a pending action item in any system that would have generated a follow-up requirement. It existed in the meeting minutes. Nobody whose current role required them to act on it had read those minutes in 2 years. Solberg's formal review memo was revised and resubmitted in August 2022. The revised version included the budget meeting minutes, the Mohn analysis, the 7-5 vote record, the 3-year monitoring commitment, the absence of a follow-up review, and the outcome data that the committee's own conditions had specified as the basis for corrective action. It was 27 pages. The Norwegian Correctional Service initiated a formal program review in October 2022. The review was conducted by an independent team with no prior involvement in the expansion program's design or approval. Its findings, published in June 2023, confirmed Solberg's analysis in full. The supplementary staffing allocation, the 5.4 million kroner that had been set aside in 2018 to preserve a political narrative, was approved for phased implementation across the 4 expansion facilities beginning in 2024. Astrid Mohn's 2018 compensation analysis was cited in the published findings as the primary evidential basis for the corrective allocation. Her name appeared in the report's acknowledgement section. She had left the organization 4 years before the report was written. Halden Fengsel continues to operate as it always has. Its kitchen program functions as designed. Its outcomes remain among the strongest in the Norwegian correctional system. International delegations continue to visit. The program continues to be cited as a model. What those citations rarely include is the chapter that followed the model's expansion. The 4 facilities that implemented versions of Halden's kitchen program between 2018 and 2022 operated for 4 years with a known gap in their design, a gap identified before implementation, set aside for political reasons, and then lost to institutional memory when the person who had raised it departed. During those 4 years, inmates in those 4 facilities participated in a program that was presented as equivalent to Halden's. They engaged with a kitchen model that looked like Halden's, used ingredients comparable to Halden's, and followed procedures modeled on Halden's. What it did not have was the staff culture that made Halden's kitchen what it actually was. And the outcomes reflected that absence in ways that the recidivism data makes visible but cannot fully describe. The Norwegian model is still the most cited example of progressive prison food philosophy in the world. The gap between what it achieved at Halden and what it produced in replication is documented, acknowledged, and now in the process of being corrected. But the 4 years between the committee's decision and the published correction represent a period during which the program's most important variable was known to be missing, was expected to be addressed, and was allowed to remain absent because the institutional memory of the commitment to address it walked out of the building with one person. That is not a Norwegian problem. It is not a correctional system problem. It is what happens in any institution where critical decisions are made conditionally, follow-up responsibility is assumed rather than assigned, and the person who would have ensured accountability moves on before the condition is met. The Halden model works. What the expansion revealed is that knowing something works and knowing why it works are not the same thing. And the distance between those two kinds of knowledge, in any institution, in any country, managing any program, is exactly where the next 4 years of missing outcomes will quietly accumulate. If this story stayed with you, the next one goes further, and the records are even harder to find.